On the shores of the Mediterranean, the sun really knows how to shine. It is so powerful that it tans the people a mahogany brown. And the young scholar who came from the north, where all the people are as white as bakers' apprentices, soon learned to regard his old friend with suspicion. In the south, one stays inside during most of the day, with the doors and shutters closed. The houses look as if everyone was asleep and no one was at home. The young foreigner felt as if he were in prison, and his shadow rolled itself up until it was smaller than it had ever been before. But as soon as the sun set and a candle lighted the room, out came the shadow again. It was truly a pleasure to watch it grow. Up the wall it would stretch itself until its head almost reached the ceiling. The stars seemed so much brighter here, thought the scholar, and he walked out onto his balcony, where he stretched himself just as his shadow had done. And on all the balconies throughout the city, people came out to enjoy the cool evening. How the town appeared dead and deserted at noon, certainly now it was alive. People were flocking into the streets. The tailors and the shoemakers moved their workbenches outside. The women came with their straight-backed chairs to sit and gossip. Donkeys heavily laden with wares tripped along like little maids. Children were everywhere. They laughed, played, and sometimes cried as children will do. The children can run so fast that they are not certain whether it is a tragedy or a comedy they are enacting. And the lights, thousands of lamps burned like so many falling stars. A funeral procession, led by little choir boys in black and white, passed the mournful but not sad-looking people following the black draped horse and wagon. The church bells were ringing. This is life, thought the young foreigner, and he tried to take it all in. Only the house directly across from his own was as quiet now as it had been at midday. The street was very narrow, and the opposite balcony was only a few yards away. Often he stood and stared at it, but no one ever came out. Yet there were flowers there, and they seemed to be flourishing, which meant that they were cared for, or else the sun would long since have withered them. Yes, he concluded, they must be watered by someone. Besides, the shutters were open, and while he never saw any light, he sometimes heard music. The scholar thought this music exquisite, but that may be only because all young northerners think everything exquisite the first time they're in the South. He asked his landlord if he knew who lived across the street, but the old man replied that he did not, and, in fact, had never seen anyone enter or leave. As for the music, he could hardly express how terrible he thought it. It's as if someone were practicing, he said, the same piece over and over and over again, and it's never played all the way through. It's unbearable. One night, the young foreigner, who slept with his balcony door open, awakened with a start. A breeze had lifted his drape so that he caught a glimpse of the opposite balcony. The flowers were ablaze with the most beautiful colors, and in their midst stood a lovely maiden. For an instant, the scholar closed his eyes to make sure that he had had them open. In a single leap, he was standing in front of the drapes. Cautiously, he parted them, but the girl had vanished. The light had disappeared, and the flowers looked as they always did. The door, however, had been left open, and from far inside he could hear music. Its gentle strains seemed to cast a spell over him, for never before had he taken such delight in his own thoughts. How does one get into that apartment? He wondered, and he perused the street below. There was no private entrance whatsoever, only a group of small shops. Surely one could not enter a home through a store. The next evening, the scholar was sitting, as usual, on his balcony. From his room, the lamp burned brightly, and since his shadow was very shy of light, it had stretched itself until it reached the opposite balcony. When the young man moved, his shadow moved. I believe my shadow is the only living thing over there, he muttered. See how it has sat down among the flowers. The balcony door is ajar. Now, if my shadow were clever, it would go inside and take a look around. Then it would come back and tell me what it had seen. Yes, you ought to earn your keep, he said jokingly. Now go inside. Did you hear me? Go. And he nodded to his shadow, and his shadow nodded back at him. Yes, go, but remember to come back again. There, the scholar's conversation with his shadow ended. The young man turned around, and the shadow also turned around. But then there happened something that no one saw. The shadow went through the half-open door of the other balcony, while the scholar went into his own room and closed the drapes behind him. The next morning, on his way to the cafe where he had his breakfast and read the newspapers, the scholar discovered that he had no shadow. So it really went away last night? He marveled. More than anything else, the young man was embarrassed. People were certain to notice, and might demand that he explain, or, worse than that, might make up explanations of their own. He returned at once to his room, and there he remained for the rest of the day. That evening he walked out onto his balcony for a bit of fresh air. The light streamed from behind him as it had on the evening before. He sat down, stood up, stretched himself. Still, there was no shadow, and though it was doubtful that anyone could see him, he hurried inside again almost immediately. But in the warm countries, everything grows much faster than it does in the north, and less than a week had passed before a shadow began to sprout from the scholar's feet. The old one must have left its roots behind. What a pleasant surprise, he thought happily. Within a month, he walked the streets unconcerned. His shadow, though a little small, was quite respectable. During the long trip, for the scholar was going home, it continued to grow until even a very big man, which the scholar was not, would not have complained about its size. Settled once more in his own country, the scholar wrote books about all that is true and beautiful and good. The days became years. The scholar was now a philosopher, and the years became many. One evening, when he was sitting alone in his room, there was a very gentle knock at the door. Come in, he called, but no one came. So the philosopher opened the door himself. Before him stood the thinnest man that he had ever seen, but, judging from his clothes, a person of some importance. Whom do I have the honor of addressing? The philosopher asked. I thought as much, replied the stranger. You don't recognize me, now that I have a body of my own and clothes to boot. You never would have believed that you would meet your old shadow again. Things have gone well for me since we parted. If need be, I can buy my freedom. The shadow jiggled its purse, which was filled with gold pieces, and touched the heavy gold chain that it wore around its neck. On all of its fingers were diamond rings, and every one was genuine. I must be dreaming, exclaimed the philosopher. What is happening? Well, it isn't something that happens every day, said the shadow. But then, You're not an ordinary person. Nobody knows that better than I do. Didn't I walk in your first footsteps? As soon as you found that I could stand alone in the world, you let me go. The results are obvious. Without bragging, I can say few could have done better. Of late, a longing has come over me to talk with you before you die. You must die, you know. Besides, I wanted to see this country again. Only a rogue does not love his native land. I know that you have a new shadow. If I owe you or it anything, you will be so kind as to tell me. Is it really you? Cried the philosopher. It's so incredible. I wouldn't have believed that one shadow could come back to one as a human being. Tell me how much I owe you, insisted the shadow. I hate to be in debt. How can you talk like that? Replied the philosopher. What debt could there be to pay? Be as free as you wish. I am only happy to see you again, and I rejoice in your good luck. Sit down, old friend. Be invited most cordially. Tell me how all this came about, and what you saw that night in the house across the street. Yes, I will tell you about it, agreed the shadow, and sat down. But first you must promise me that you will never tell anyone that I was once your shadow. I've been thinking of becoming engaged. After all, I am quite rich, enough to support a large family. Don't give it another moment's thought, the philosopher said. I will never tell anyone who you really are. Here is my hand on it. A man is no better than his word. And a word is a shadow, remarked the shadow, because it could not speak otherwise. It was really amazing how human the shadow appeared. It was dressed completely in black, but everything was of the finest quality, from its patent leather boots to its hat of the softest felt. The gold chain and the rings have already been described, but one's eye fell upon them so often that one cannot help mentioning them again. Yes, the shadow was well dressed, and clothes make the man. Now I shall begin, announced the shadow, and it stamped its boots as hard as it could on the philosopher's new shadow, which was curled up like a poodle at the feet of the man. Perhaps it did this because it hoped to attach the philosopher's shadow to itself, or maybe just because it was arrogant. But the new shadow did not appear ruffled. It lay perfectly still and listened, for it too wanted to know how one could be free and become one's own master. Do you know who lived in the house across the street? Asked the shadow. That's the best of all. It was poetry. I was there for 3 years and read everything that's ever been composed or written. This I say, and what I say is true. I have seen all and I know all. Poetry, cried the philosopher. Yes, yes. She's often a hermit in the big cities. I saw her myself once, but only for a short moment, and my eyes were drowsy from sleep. She was standing on the balcony, and it was as if the northern lights were shining around her. Go on, go on. There you were on the balcony. Then you walked through the doorway, and I was in the entrance hall. That's what you sat looking at all the time, the vestibule. There was no lamp in there, and that's why, from the outside, the apartment appeared dark. But there was a door. It opened onto another room, which opened onto another, which opened onto another. There was a long row of rooms and anterooms before one reached the innermost, where poetry lived, and these were ablaze with more than enough light to kill a shadow. So I never saw the maiden up close. I was cautious and patient, and that is the same as being virtuous. Come, come, commanded the philosopher curtly. Tell me what you saw. Everything, and I'll tell you about it. But first, it has nothing whatever to do with pride, but out of respect to my accomplishments, not to speak of my social position. I wish you wouldn't address me so familiarly. Forgive me, exclaimed the philosopher. It is an old habit, and they are the hardest to get rid of. But you are quite right, and I'll try to remember. Please do continue, for I am immensely interested. Everything. I have seen all. I know all. I beg you to tell me about the innermost room where poetry dwelled. Was it like the beech forest in spring? Was it like the interior of a great cathedral? Or was it like the heavens when one stands on a mountain top? Everything was there, replied the shadow. Of course, I never went all the way in. The twilight of the vestibule suited me better, and from there I had an excellent view. I saw everything and I know all. I was at the court of poetry in the entrance hall. But what did you see? Urged the philosopher. Did Thor and Odin walk those halls? Did Achilles and Hector fight their battles again? Or did innocent children play there and tell of their dreams? I'm telling you that I was there, and you understand. I saw everything that there was to see. You cannot have stayed there and remained a human being. But it made a human being of me. I quickly came to understand my inmost nature, that part of me which from birth can claim kinship to poetry. When I lived with you, I didn't even think about such things. You remember that I was always larger at sunrise and at sunset, and that I was more noticeable in the moonlight than you were. Still, I had no understanding of my nature. That did not come until I was in the vestibule, and then I became a human being. I was fully mature when I came out. By then you had already left the South. Being human made me ashamed to go around as I was. I needed boots, clothes, and all other trimmings that made a man what he is. So there was nothing else for me to do but hide. I wouldn't say this to anyone but you, and you mustn't mention it in any of your books. I hid under the skirts of the women who sold gingerbread men in the market. Luckily, she never found out how much her petticoats concealed. I came out only in the evening. Then I would walk around in the moonlight, stretching myself up the walls to get the kinks out of my back. Up and down the streets I went, peeping through the windows of the attics as well as of the drawing rooms, and I saw what no one ever sees, what no one ever should see. It's really a horrible world, and I wouldn't be human if it weren't so desirable. I saw things that ought to be unthinkable, and these were not only done by husbands and wives, but by parents and the sweet, innocent children. I saw, said the shadow, I saw everything that man must not know, but what he most ardently wishes to know, his neighbor's evil. If I had written a newspaper, everyone would have read it, but instead I wrote directly to the persons themselves, and I wreaked havoc in every city that I came to. People feared me so much and were so fond of me. The universities gave me honorary degrees, the tailors gave me clothes, and the women said that I was handsome. In a word, each donated what he could, and so I became the man that I am. But it is getting late, and I must say goodbye. Here's my card. I live on the sunnier side of the street, and am always home when it rains. How strange, remarked the philosopher after the shadow had left. The years and the days passed, and the shadow came again. "How are things going?" they asked. "Oh," replied the philosopher, "I have been writing about all that is true and beautiful and good, but no one cares to hear about anything like that, and I am terribly disappointed, because those are the things that are dear to me." "Well, they aren't to me," said the shadow. "I've been concentrating on gaining weight, and that there's some point in. You don't understand the world. That's what's the matter with you. You ought to travel. I'm going on a trip this summer. Would you like to join me? If you would like to travel as my shadow, it would be a pleasure to have you along. I'll pay for your trip." "You go too far," retorted the philosopher. "It all depends how you look at it. The trip will do you good, and, traveling as my shadow, you'll have all your expenses paid by me." "Monstrous!" shouted the philosopher. "But that's the way of the world, and it isn't going to change," said the shadow, and left. Matters did not improve for the philosopher. On the contrary, sorrow and misery had attached themselves to his coat tails. For the most part, whenever he spoke of the true and the beautiful and the good, it was like setting roses before a cow. Finally, he became seriously ill. "You look like a shadow of your former self," people would say, and when he heard these words, a shiver went down his spine. "You ought to go to a health resort," suggested the shadow when it came to visit him again. "There's no other alternative. I'll take you along for old time's sake. I'll pay the expenses, and you'll talk and try to amuse me along the journey. I'm going to a spa myself, because my beard won't grow. That's a disease too, you know, because beards are a necessity. If you're sensible, you'll accept. We'll travel as friends." And so they traveled, the shadow as master and the master as shadow. For whether they were being driven in a coach, riding horseback, or simply walking, they were always side by side, and the shadow kept itself a little in the fore or in the rear, according to the direction of the sun. It knew how to create the impression that it was the superior. The philosopher, however, was not aware of any of this. He had a kind heart, which did not even have a guest room reserved for envy. The journey was not yet over when the philosopher suggested to the shadow, "Now that we're traveling companions, and when you consider the fact that we've grown up together, shouldn't we call each other by first names? It makes for a much pleasanter atmosphere." "There's something in what you say," began the shadow, who now was a real master. "You have spoken frankly, and what you have said is well meant. Therefore, I ought to be honest with you. As a philosopher, you know how strange nature can be. Some people cannot bear to have a rough piece of material next to their bodies, and others can hear a nail scratching on glass without it upsetting their nervous systems. Well, I would have the same feeling if you were to call me by my first name. I would have the feeling that I was being pressed to the ground, as if my relationship to you had never changed. You understand, it's merely a feeling. It has nothing whatever to do with pride. But I could call you by your first name and satisfy half of your request." From then on, the shadow always spoke and referred to the philosopher by his first name. "He goes too far," thought the man. "He's hardly civil to me." But when one is poor, he does more thinking than speaking. At last they arrived at the famous resort where people came from all over the world to be cured. Among the guests was a beautiful princess who suffered from seeing too clearly, which is a very painful disease. She noticed at once that one of the new arrivals was very different from everyone else. He had come to make his beard grow, she was told. But that's not the real reason, she muttered to herself, and, to satisfy her curiosity, she went right up and spoke to the stranger, for the daughter of a king need not stand on ceremony with anyone. Your trouble is that you cannot cast a shadow, the princess announced. Your royal highness is getting well, exclaimed the shadow. I know that you suffered from seeing too clearly, but you must be getting over it. You show signs of perfect health. I grant you that it is a very unusual one, but I do have a shadow. Other people have just ordinary shadows, but I despise the ordinary. You know how one dresses one's servants so that their livery is finer than one's own clothes. Well, I have let my shadow pretend that he is human. As you can see, I have even brought him a shadow. It was very expensive, but I am fond of doing the original. What? Thought the princess. Have I really been cured? This is the finest spa there is. How fortunate I am to be born in the time when these marvelous waters were discovered. But just because I am well is no reason to leave. I am enjoying myself here. That stranger interests me. I hope his beard won't grow too quickly. That night there was a grand ball that everyone attended, and the shadow danced with the princess. The princess was light on her toes, but the shadow was even lighter. Such a graceful partner she had never had before. They discovered that he had once visited her country while she was abroad. There, too, the shadow had peeped through all the windows, those that faced the street and those that did not. He had seen both this and that, and he knew how to tell about some of what he had seen and how to hint at the rest, which was even more impressive. The princess was astounded. She had never spoken to anyone who was so worldly wise, and out of respect for what he knew, she danced with him again. The next time they danced together, the princess fell in love. The shadow noticed the sudden change with relief. She's finally been cured of seeing too clearly, he thought. The princess would have confessed her feelings immediately if she hadn't been so prudent. She thought of her realm and of the people she ruled. He knows well the ways of the world. That's a good sign, she commented silently. He dances well. That is also a virtue. But is he really educated? For that is very important. I better test him. Then she began to ask the shadow questions so difficult that she herself did not know the answers. An expression of confusion came over the shadow's face. You cannot answer? Exclaimed the princess. I learned the answers to questions like that in childhood, said the shadow. I believe that even my shadow, who is sitting over there by the door, could respond correctly. Your shadow? That really would be remarkable. I can't say for certain, continued the shadow. I just wouldn't be surprised if he could. After all, he's never done anything but follow me around and listen to what I say. Yes, he cried in a sudden burst of enthusiasm. I believe he will be able to answer you. But, Your Royal Highness, if you will allow me to make a suggestion, my shadow is so proud of being thought to be human. If Your Royal Highness wishes to create the right atmosphere so that the shadow will be able to do his best, please treat him as if he were a man. I prefer it that way, said the king's daughter, and she joined the philosopher, who was alongside the door. She questioned him about the sun and the moon, and about the human race, both inside and out, and he answered every query, both cleverly and politely. What must the man be worth, if his shadow is so wise? Thought the princess, It would be a blessing for my people if I chose him for my husband. I shall do it. The shadow was very amenable. It agreed without hesitation that their plans must not be revealed until the princess had returned home. I'll not even tell my shadow, he said, while he thought how admirably the world had been created. Not long after they came to the land which the princess ruled whenever she was there. My good friend, the shadow began to the philosopher, now that I am as happy and as powerful as anyone can hope to be, I'd like to share my good fortune with you. You may live with me always, here in the castle. You may drive with me in the royal coach, and you will be paid 100,000 gold pieces a year. In return, all I ask is that you let everyone call you a shadow, that you never admit to anyone that you have ever been a human being, and that once a year, when I sit on the balcony so that the people can pay me homage, you lie at my feet as a shadow should. I might as well tell you that I am marrying the princess, and the wedding is tonight. No, this cannot happen, cried the philosopher. I don't want to do it, and I won't. You are a fraud. I will tell everything. You fool both the people and the princess. But now I will tell them that I am a human being and that you are only my shadow, who's been masquerading as a man. No one will believe you, warned the shadow. Now be reasonable, or I'll call the guard. I intend to ask for an audience with the princess, replied the philosopher. But I will speak with her first, said the shadow, and you will be imprisoned. The shadow's threat very quickly became a reality, for the royal sentry knew whom the princess had chosen to be her husband. You are shivering, remarked the princess as soon as he entered her chambers. You must not get sick this evening, not for the wedding. I've just had the most horrible experience that one can have, replied the shadow. Imagine, oh, how fragile a shadow's brain must be. My shadow has gone mad. He believes he is a man, and that I am his shadow. How dreadful, she exclaimed. He isn't running around loose, I hope. No, no, he's not, he said softly. I am so afraid he will never get well. Poor shadow, continued the princess. He must be suffering terribly. It would really be kinder to free him from that particle of life he has. Yet the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that it's necessary for him to be done away with. Quietly, of course. It seems so cruel, said the shadow, when I think of how loyal a servant it was, and a sound resembling a sigh escaped from the shadow's lips. How noble you are, exclaimed the princess. That night the whole city was brilliantly lighted. The cannons were shot off. Bum, bum, bum. The soldiers presented arms. Oh, what a wedding it was! The shadow and the princess came out onto the balcony, and the people screamed, Hooray! The philosopher heard nothing of all this, for they had already taken his life.